The galactic convergence had been around for roughly 4,000 years, give or take a century. And in that time, we had absorbed, negotiated with, or simply outlasted 217 distinct civilizations. 217. We kept count. We had monuments, we had ceremonies. We had a very enthusiastic historian named Voruk, who wrote exhausting 12-volume encyclopedias about each one. And honestly, Voruk needed a hobby that wasn't that. But here we were. The point is, we knew how this worked. A species rises, gets clever, builds ships, starts poking around the stars, and then they meet us. And then, depending on how reasonable they are, they either join the convergence peacefully, or they make a series of increasingly poor decisions that end with them joining the convergence considerably less peacefully. Either way, they join. That was the pattern. That was the formula. It had never, not once in 4,000 years, deviated in any meaningful way. And then we found Earth. Now, let me be absolutely clear about something. Nobody on the High Council wanted a war with humanity. Nobody. Not even Admiral Sekoth, who genuinely enjoyed wars the way some beings enjoy competitive gardening, enthusiastically, frequently, and with disturbing personal investment. Even Sekoth looked at the preliminary reports on humanity and said quietly, to nobody in particular, "I don't know about this one." That should have been the warning. That should have been the moment we all sat down, poured something strong, and had a very different conversation. We did not do that. What we did instead was send a diplomat. Her name was Counselor Drea Voss, and she was, by every measurable standard, the finest diplomat in the convergence. 40 years of service, 32 successful integrations. She had once talked a species of hive-mind fungal colonies into a trade agreement using nothing but tone of voice and carefully chosen metaphors about soil composition. She was extraordinary. She was also, within 6 hours of landing on Earth, deeply confused in a way that her 40 years had not prepared her for. Her first report back read as follows, and I'm quoting directly because I feel you need the full experience. The humans welcomed me with a ceremony involving fire, meat on sticks, and a beverage that I believe is technically a mild neurotoxin, which they consume recreationally and in significant quantities. They laughed at things I did not understand. They also laughed at things I did understand, but for completely different reasons than I expected. They gave me a small hat. I am wearing the small hat. I don't know why I'm wearing the small hat. I feel that refusing the hat would have been impolite. Please advise. The council read this report 3 times. Nobody advised anything because nobody knew what to say about the hat. Drea's follow-up reports were not more reassuring. Humans, she explained, were simultaneously the most welcoming and the most impossible species she had ever encountered. They would share their food, their homes, their absurd hat traditions with a complete stranger from outer space without hesitation, and then in the same afternoon have a loud, passionate disagreement with each other about something called the correct way to make eggs. She attended one of these disagreements. It lasted 2 hours. No violence occurred, but the emotional intensity, she noted, was comparable to a mid-tier border conflict she had mediated in the Dravari sector. They were contradictions, wrapped in other contradictions, wearing hats. But here's the thing. Here's the part that should have made everything obvious to anyone paying attention. Drea kept saying the same phrase in every report. She kept saying it quietly, almost as an aside, like she wasn't sure how to categorize it. She kept saying, "They are not afraid, not of her, not of the ship, not of the fact that there was, sitting in orbit above their planet, a convergence fleet of 40 vessels, each one larger than most of their cities." They looked up at that fleet, and some of them took photographs. Some of them started arguments online about whether the ships were real. One human, a coastal fisherman named Benedict Harrell, apparently waved at the fleet every morning while drinking his neurotoxin beverage, just in case someone was watching. Someone was watching. It was Lieutenant Quiss of the 3rd Orbital Detachment, and he waved back and then filed an incident report about it because he didn't know what else to do. This should have told us everything. It told us nothing. The problem, you see, was Counselor Mav Pellin. Mav Pellin was the kind of political creature that every large organization produces eventually. Smooth, ambitious, perpetually convinced that he was the smartest entity in any given room, and wrong about that in a way that was almost impressive in its consistency. Mav Pellin looked at Drea's reports, looked at the human homeworld, looked at its single inhabited planet with its single moon and its quaint little technological infrastructure, and he made a calculation. The calculation was wrong. The calculation was so wrong that future historians, yes, including Voruk, who wrote another exhaustive encyclopedia specifically about this, would use it as a case study in what they eventually titled, "The Comprehensive Failure of Assuming You Understand Something You Have Not Bothered to Understand." Mav Pellen's calculation was simple. Earth was small, humanity was young, and the convergence was ancient and vast. Integration by diplomacy was taking too long. Integration by demonstration of force would be faster, cleaner, and would establish the proper. He used the word hierarchy. He used it in a memo. The memo survived. Historians have opinions about the memo. Drea, when she heard the plan, sent a single response. It contained no diplomatic language, no formal structure, no careful phrasing. It said, and again I'm quoting directly, "Do not do this. I am asking you specifically and sincerely, do not do this. You do not understand what you are looking at." The council thanked her for her perspective and proceeded. Admiral Sekath was given command of the operation. He took it without his usual enthusiasm. He took it the way you take something you've been handed that you suspect is going to explode, because Sekath, whatever his other qualities, was genuinely good at reading situations. He reviewed every file on humanity. He read about their history, their wars, their recoveries, their collapses and resurrections, the way they had torn each other apart for centuries and kept going anyway. He called his second-in-command, a calm and methodical officer named Commander Eula Dreth, into his quarters, and he said, "Eula, I want you to read the section on their 20th century." Eula read it. She was quiet for a long time afterward. "Sir," she said finally, "they did that to each other." "Yes," said Sekath. "They don't even have faster-than-light travel yet. No. And they did that. Yes." Eula closed the file. "And we're going to tell them what to do." Sekath didn't answer. He looked out the viewport at the blue-green planet below, at the white clouds swirling over the oceans, at the lights of their cities scattered across the night side like spilled fire. Benedict Harl was probably down there somewhere, waving at them with his morning beverage. It struck Sekath, somewhat uncomfortably, as the gesture of someone who had absolutely nothing to fear. The operation began at 0600 Standard Time on a Tuesday, which meant nothing to us but meant a great deal to a particular human named Minister Adeze Okafor, who had a very important meeting scheduled for that Tuesday, and was, according to her aide, professionally furious about the interruption. Minister Okafor was Earth's designated point of contact for alien affairs, a position that had been created somewhat hastily approximately 4 months ago when we showed up, and she had been handling it with the kind of focused, relentless competence that made Drea's reports suddenly make a lot more sense in hindsight. Sekath opened a channel to the surface. He had prepared remarks. They were formal, measured, and designed to make the military situation clear without being unnecessarily provocative. This was technically still a diplomatic operation with military backing, or so Mav Pellen's memo insisted. Sekath got 3 sentences in before Adeze Okafor interrupted him. "Admiral," she said, "I'm going to stop you there." He stopped. "I've read your standard integration protocol. I obtained a copy through Counselor Voss, who has been very helpful and who, I want to say publicly, has been an excellent representative of your government. But I need you to understand something before we go any further." Her voice was measured. It was the voice of someone choosing every word with the precision of a surgeon. "We are aware of what you're doing. We understand the implicit threat, and I need you to understand very clearly that the implicit threat is the problem." Sekath looked at Eula. Eula looked at him. "Not the fleet," Okafor continued, "not the weapons, not the size of your ships or the age of your civilization. The problem is that you came here and pointed something at us and expected us to flinch. And Admiral, I say this with complete respect for your position and your civilization, we don't flinch." Somewhere in the fleet, a sensor operator named Tovi Shan was monitoring Earth's communication networks. He was watching the planet's reaction to the fleet's opening maneuvers, watching for panic, for emergency broadcasts, for the kinds of signals that typically preceded a civilization's surrender or its desperate last-stand transmission. He'd seen both many times. He knew what they looked like. He was watching something else. He pulled up his commanding officer's channel with slightly unsteady hands. "Lieutenant Commander," he said, I need you to see the surface feeds. Lieutenant Commander Preth leaned over his console. She stared at the feeds. She stared at them for a long time. Humanity was not panicking. Humanity was not hiding. Humanity was not transmitting emergency signals or scrambling civilian populations into shelters, or doing any of the 412 things the Convergence's behavioral models predicted a pre-FTL civilization would do when confronted with an overwhelming orbital military force. Humanity was mobilizing, not in fear, not in desperation, in something that Tovi Shan, who had studied 46 species over his career, and thought he had a reasonable handle on the range of emotional responses biological life was capable of, could only describe as a kind of cold, organized, extremely purposeful anger. Every military asset on the planet was moving. They were moving with a coordination that suggested this was not improvised, that somewhere, months ago, when the Convergence fleet first appeared in orbit, and some humans took photographs, and some started arguments, and Benedict Harrell waved every morning. Other humans, quiet, methodical, serious humans in rooms with a lot of screens, had looked at the fleet and begun making plans, contingency plans, detailed ones. Tovi Shan pulled up the energy signatures. They were building something, several somethings, across 6 continents, in facilities that had been, until approximately 40 minutes ago, quietly humming along doing something that the Convergence scans had categorized as industrial manufacturing, which was technically accurate and also spectacularly incomplete. He ran the energy signatures through the analysis system. The system took longer than usual. This was not a good sign. The analysis system was fast. When it took longer than usual, it meant it had encountered something that didn't fit existing categories and was having to construct new ones. Lieutenant Commander Tovi said, very quietly, "I think we need to call the Admiral." Sekath received Tovi Shan's report at 0634 Standard Time, which meant he had been conducting this operation for exactly 34 minutes before everything he thought he understood about it changed completely. He read the analysis twice, then he called Eula Dreth. Then he looked out the viewport again, at the blue-green planet, which looked exactly the same as it always had, peaceful, luminous, slightly damp, and was somehow producing energy signatures that his analysis system was still, even now, struggling to categorize. "Talk to me," he said to Eula. Eula had her own copy of the report on her console, and the expression on her face was the one she reserved for situations that fell outside her considerable experience. "They had this ready," she said. "This wasn't reactive. They didn't build this in the last 34 minutes. No. They built this while waving at us." Sekath said nothing. Outside, Benedict Harrell was probably on his 3rd neurotoxin beverage by now. What the analysis system eventually, reluctantly, one almost felt confirmed was this. Humanity had spent the 4 months since the Convergence's arrival doing several things simultaneously. They had been diplomatic, cooperative, and genuinely warm through Counselor Drea Voss's meetings. They had been photographing the fleet and arguing about it online. They had been sending Adieze Okafor to meetings where she was calm and precise and asked excellent questions, and they had been in the quiet hours, in the facilities that hummed, taking 4 months of careful observation of Convergence technology, and doing what humans apparently did with new information, which was immediately figure out how to use it as a starting point for something else entirely. They hadn't copied the technology. That would have been straightforward. That would have been expected. 12 species in Convergence history had attempted to reverse engineer Convergence weapons after first contact. It never worked particularly well, because Convergence technology was the product of 4,000 years of accumulated development, and you couldn't shortcut 4,000 years in 4 months. Humanity hadn't tried to shortcut it. They had looked at the technology, understood the underlying principles, and then gone in a completely different direction using those principles as a foundation. The result was something the analysis system kept describing with increasingly uncertain language, cycling through classifications like energy projection system, then propulsion-adjacent weaponry, then finally settling on the deeply unhelpful novel threat vector, classification pending. Tovi Shan, who had been staring at his console for the better part of an hour, raised his hand. "Sir, I've been running comparisons. What they've built, the closest thing in our database, is the Vethari Convergence period weapons from about 3,000 years ago. except the Vethari took 60 years to develop those after first contact with our technology. Sekath turned slowly. Humanity did it in 4 months. 4 months, Tovi confirmed, with the tone of someone who had just personally witnessed the universe revise its own rulebook. And sir, the Vethari weapons were the reason we had to renegotiate the entire Eastern Sector Treaty in year 2040 of the Convergence, because nothing we had at the time could adequately counter them. The bridge was very quiet. Eula Dreth broke the silence with exactly the observation that needed to be made. So to summarize, she said carefully, we arrived at a pre-FTL civilization, spent 4 months being diplomatic, gave them enough time to observe our technology, and they used that window to invent something that 3,000 years ago would have destabilized the Convergence. She paused. In 4 months. That's an accurate summary, said Sekath. And then we pointed weapons at them. Also accurate. I'm going to find Mav Pellin's memo, Eula said, and I'm going to keep it forever. Down on the surface, Adeze Okafor was still on the open channel. She had been patient, remarkably patient, Sekath thought, for someone whose planet currently had an orbital fleet in aggressive formation above it. She had waited through his silence and his communications with his crew with the composure of someone who held significantly better cards than the other party, and knew it, and was, out of what could only be described as courtesy, giving him time to figure that out himself. Admiral, she said, and her voice had not changed at all. Still measured, still precise. I want you to understand that none of what we've prepared has been activated. Nothing has been armed. We are not at this moment doing anything other than making sure you have complete information. Sekath keyed the channel. Minister Okafor, Admiral Sekath, you prepared all of this. 4 months ago. We prepared contingencies, she said. We prepare contingencies for everything. It's something of a cultural habit. You would be astonished how many contingency plans this planet has for how many different scenarios. Some of them are quite creative. A brief pause. A few are alarming, frankly, even to us. The weapons systems your facilities are producing are not weapons systems, Okafor said, calmly. They are deterrents. There is a difference, and the difference matters. A weapons system is something you build because you intend to use it. A deterrent is something you build because you want very sincerely never to have to use it. Another pause, shorter this time. We would like very sincerely never to have to use it, Admiral. Sekath sat with that for a moment. On his secondary console, Tovi Shan was quietly updating the analysis report. The facilities on the surface were still running. The energy signatures were still building. The humans were not powering down. They were not standing down. They were finishing what they had started, methodically and without hurry, and they were doing it while their minister kept a completely civil conversation going on an open channel, because apparently humanity was entirely capable of a civilizational military mobilization and a diplomatic negotiation at the same time, simultaneously, without either one suffering for the other's attention. Sekath thought about the 20th century section in the file. He thought about what Eula had said. They did that to each other. Counselor Voss, he said on the internal channel. Drea's voice came back immediately. She had been waiting. Admiral, you said we didn't understand what we were looking at. A long breath. Not quite a sigh. Something more tired than that. I said it in 4 separate reports. What are we looking at, Drea? And Drea Voss, 40 years of service, 32 successful integrations, the finest diplomat in the Convergence, said the thing she had been trying to say in careful diplomatic language for 4 months, except this time she said it plainly, because plainly was what the moment required. You're looking at a species that has been through everything, she said. War, plague, collapse, recovery, war again. They have burned everything they built and rebuilt it better, over and over, for thousands of years, on one planet, with nothing but each other and whatever they could make with their hands. They are not brave because they don't understand danger. They are brave because they understand it completely. They have always lived inside it, and they came out the other side every single time. She stopped. Then, and they are kind, Admiral. That's the part that undoes me, honestly. After all of it, after every terrible thing they've done to each other and survived, they still wave at strangers from other stars. They still give people small hats. A pause. I'm still wearing the hat. Sekath looked at Eula. Eula looked at him. Neither of them said anything for a moment, and then Eula said, Very quietly, "I want a hat." What happened in the next 6 hours is, by now, fairly well documented, mostly because Voruk wrote an 8-volume series about it and presented copies to the council unsolicited. Sekath contacted Mav Pelin, and that conversation, while not recorded in full, is generally understood to have been extremely direct. The fleet's aggressive formation was dissolved and replaced with a standard diplomatic positioning pattern. Drea Voss was formally reinstated as lead negotiator with a significantly expanded mandate and an apology that she accepted graciously while still wearing the hat. The negotiations that followed were unlike any the Convergence had conducted in 4,000 years, and not because they were difficult. They were in fact remarkably smooth, once the relevant parties accepted that humanity was not going to be integrated so much as introduced to the Convergence as something closer to an equal partner, which was a concept that required some urgent revision of several foundational documents and gave the Council's legal team a collectively sleepless month, but was ultimately achievable. What made the negotiations unusual was humanity's approach to them. Minister Okafor brought a team of 12. 3 of them were diplomats. 2 were scientists who kept asking Convergence representatives detailed technical questions with the focused intensity of people cataloging information for later use. 1 was a historian named Fatou Diallo, who spent most of the sessions taking notes with an expression of barely contained joy, and who, on the 3rd day, presented Voruk with a copy of a human history book, which Voruk received with trembling hands and immediately disappeared for 48 hours to read. 1 was a chef, which baffled everyone until the chef produced a meal on the 4th evening that resulted in 3 senior Convergence officials voluntarily revising their dietary habits permanently. The remaining 5 had roles that were never entirely made clear, and when Drea asked Okafor about them privately, Okafor smiled and said they were there for contingencies, and Drea decided not to ask further. The deterrent systems were powered down on day 6, quietly and without announcement. Tovishan noticed on his console and reported it to Sekath, who nodded once and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. The humans had held those systems running for 6 days, not as a threat exactly, but as a reminder of what the reminder was. When they were satisfied, they turned them off. No ceremony, no statement, just the energy signatures going quiet, like someone putting down something heavy they had been carrying for a while. A junior analyst named Preva Soul, who was 23 years old and had been on her first assignment when the fleet reached Earth and had spent the last several months absorbing everything she could about humanity in between her regular duties, submitted a personal observation report that was not required of her and that her supervisors almost didn't read, and very nearly changed everything about how the Convergence subsequently approached first contact situations. The report was 6 paragraphs. The last paragraph read, "We spent 4,000 years believing we understood what strength looked like because we had always been the strongest thing in the room. Humanity is the first species we've encountered that understood strength differently, not as the absence of vulnerability, but as the decision to keep going anyway. I don't think our models for evaluating civilizations account for this. I think they should." Preva Soul was promoted twice in the following year. Voruk cited her report in the introduction to all 8 volumes. She found this embarrassing and flattering in roughly equal measure. The formal integration, partnership, technically, the legal team had been very insistent on the distinction, was signed on a Thursday morning, Earth time, in a building in a city by an ocean, with large windows that let in pale winter sunlight. Adiaze Okafor signed for Earth. Drea Voss signed for the Convergence, still wearing the hat, and nobody on either side commented on this because it had by now become simply part of the proceedings. After the signing, Sekath stood at a window looking out at the ocean for a long time. He was thinking about the fleet in orbit, and about Tovishan's face when the analysis system struggled, and about Eula saying they did that to each other, and about Benedict Harel waving every morning at a fleet of 40 ships with a beverage in his hand, and absolutely nothing in his eyes that resembled fear. Eula came to stand beside him. "You know," she said, "in a few years, when humanity develops FTL capability, they'll do it faster than we expect," Sekath said. "Yes. And then they'll want to see everything." "Everything," Eula agreed. "All of it. Every corner of it. They'll ask questions the whole way." Sekath thought about that. He thought about 4,000 years of Convergence history, and 217 civilizations in 12 volumes each. And then he thought about Fatou Diallo's expression when she looked at Voruk's encyclopedias that barely contained joy, that hunger that was the opposite of threatening, and somehow more overwhelming for it. Good, he said finally. And somewhere on the coast below, Benedict Harrell was probably raising his morning beverage at the ships in orbit. And somewhere in the fleet, Lieutenant Quiss of the 3rd Orbital Detachment was probably raising a hand in return, because by now it was simply part of the routine, the small ordinary gesture between a man on a coastline and a soldier in orbit that had somehow, without anyone quite deciding it would, become a symbol of something the Convergence's historians were already arguing about the proper way to describe. Drea Voss asked later what she thought the gesture meant, considered the question for a moment, and then said it meant exactly what it looked like: a greeting, an acknowledgement, the simple, stubborn, impossible human insistence on treating the vast and unknown universe as something worth saying good morning to. She was still wearing the hat when she said it.